The conference room at Morrison & Associates felt suffocating as my mother's voice cut through the air like broken glass. "The lake house goes into our family trust," Linda declared, her manicured fingers drumming against the mahogany table. My father, Robert, nodded with the smugness of someone who believed he held all the cards. I sat frozen watching these two people I had called my parents for 32 years attempt to steal the one thing that truly belonged to me. When trust attorney James Morrison requested proof of ownership, I quietly slid my title insurance policy across the polished surface. The silence that followed was deafening. The weight of betrayal pressed against my chest as I stared at the legal documents scattered before us. Morrison's eyebrows furrowed as he examined my title policy, then glanced at the trust paperwork my parents had confidently presented moments earlier. "There seems to be a discrepancy here," Morrison said carefully, his voice carrying the cautious tone of someone navigating dangerous waters. "The property deed shows Natalie as the sole owner purchased 24 months ago." My mother's laugh rang hollow in the sterile office space. "Of course it does, James. We put it in her name for tax purposes, but the family funded the purchase." Her eyes held that familiar manipulative gleam I had somehow missed for decades. The memory hit me like a physical blow. 3 years ago, when Grandma Rose passed away, she had left me $50,000 in her will. I remembered sitting in this very law firm, though, in a different conference room, as the estate attorney explained my inheritance. My parents had been so supportive, so helpful in guiding me through the process. "Sweetheart," my father had said back then, "inheritance money can be tricky for tax purposes. Let us help you manage it properly." I had trusted them completely, signing papers I barely read, allowing them to handle what seemed like overwhelming financial complexity. Now, as Morrison continued examining the documents, the truth began crystallizing with horrifying clarity. My parents had convinced me to let them manage the inheritance, claiming they needed to set up special accounts and investment vehicles. I had been so grateful for their guidance, so relieved not to handle the complicated financial details myself. "The down payment for this property," I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper, "came from my grandmother's inheritance." My mother's face shifted, her expression becoming more defensive. "Family money, dear. Rose would have wanted this to benefit all of us. But I paid for it." I continued, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "With my money, the money Grandma Rose left specifically to me." Robert leaned forward, producing a folder I had never seen before. "Actually, Natalie, I co-signed the mortgage. Technically, this makes me a legal owner as well." He spread several papers across the table with theatrical confidence. Morrison studied the mortgage documents, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "Mr. Patterson, I'm not seeing your signature on any of the original lending paperwork here. The mortgage application shows Natalie as the sole borrower." The color drained from my father's face, but he quickly recovered. "There must be additional paperwork. The bank required a co-signer given Natalie's credit situation at the time." My mind raced back to the mortgage application process. I remembered sitting alone at the bank, providing my employment information, my credit score, my financial statements. There had been no co-signer, no additional documentation. I had qualified for the loan entirely on my own merits. "That's not true," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I applied for the mortgage myself. I qualified based on my income from the marketing firm." Linda's eyes filled with crocodile tears. "Natalie, honey, you're remembering incorrectly. We've been helping you financially for years. This lake house represents family investment, family dreams. Grandma Rose bought it for all of us in a sense." The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I almost believed her. This was the same tone she had used when I was 12, and she convinced me I had imagined seeing her take money from my birthday cards. The same voice she used when I was 16, and she made me believe I had misplaced the savings bonds my grandfather had given me. Morrison cleared his throat. "I need to see complete financial records for this transaction. Bank statements, wire transfers, the complete paper trail." He looked directly at my parents. "If there were family contributions to this purchase, there should be clear documentation." My father's jaw tightened. "Of course, James. We'll provide whatever you need. This is just a misunderstanding." But I was beginning to remember things that hadn't seemed important before. Phone calls that stopped when I entered rooms, hushed conversations between my parents that ceased whenever I approached, documents that disappeared from the kitchen counter where I thought I had left them. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked the question, escaping before I could stop it. Planning what dear Linda's voice carried wounded innocence, but her eyes flickered with something else, something calculating. Morrison gathered the papers, his discomfort becoming more apparent. "I think we need to reconvene once I've had time to review all the documentation thoroughly. There are several inconsistencies that need clarification." As we prepared to leave, I caught my parents exchanging a look that made my blood run cold. It was the expression of conspirators whose carefully laid plans were beginning to unravel. Walking to the parking garage, my mother linked her arm through mine with false affection. "Sweetheart, I hope you understand we're only trying to protect the family assets. Estate planning can be so complicated." But protection wasn't what I had seen in that conference room. What I had witnessed was something far more sinister, far more calculated than simple family financial planning. 2 days later, Morrison's call shattered any remaining illusions I held about my parents' integrity. His voice carried a gravity that made my hands tremble as I gripped the phone. "Natalie, I need you to come in immediately. What I've discovered requires urgent attention." The law office felt different this time, charged with an electricity that made my skin crawl. Morrison sat behind his desk, surrounded by bankers' boxes and manila folders that seemed to multiply like cancer cells across every available surface. "I've spent the past 48 hours going through financial records." He began, his face pale with exhaustion. "What I found is deeply troubling." He pushed a stack of bank statements toward me. "These are copies of accounts I never knew existed." My eyes scanned the papers, struggling to process what I was seeing. Account after account bore my name, my social security number, my address. But the signatures on the signature cards weren't mine. They forged my signature. I whispered the reality, hitting me like a physical blow. "Multiple times across multiple institutions," Morrison confirmed. "This joint account here was opened 18 months ago. Your parents have been depositing rental income from the lake house." Rental income. The words felt foreign in my mouth. I never authorized any rentals. Morrison produced another folder, this one bulging with correspondence. "Mountain View Rental Management has been handling bookings for the past year and a half. They've been sending payments to this account your parents opened in your name." The rental management contract bore my forged signature, executed with such precision that even I might have believed I had signed it. The monthly statements showed consistent income, thousands of dollars flowing into accounts I had never seen. How much, I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Total rental income over 18 months appears to be approximately $38,000, Morrison said quietly, "none of which was reported on your tax returns." My stomach lurched. My tax returns. That's another problem. Morrison's expression grew even more grave. "Your parents have been filing amended returns claiming the lake house as a business property. They've been deducting expenses, claiming depreciation, essentially treating your personal residence as their investment property for tax purposes." The room began spinning as the full scope of their deception became clear. They hadn't just stolen my inheritance money. They had built an entire financial empire on the foundation of my identity and my property. "There's more." Morrison continued, though I wasn't sure how much more betrayal I could absorb. "I've discovered offshore transfers. Money from these accounts has been moving to banks in the Cayman Islands." He showed me wire transfer receipts, each one bearing my forged authorization, each one moving substantial amounts of money far beyond the reach of American authorities. "I have to tell you something else," Morrison said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Your father and I were roommates in college. He contacted me specifically to handle this trust arrangement. I thought I was doing a favor for an old friend. The personal connection explained so much. Why my parents had seemed so confident in their legal maneuvering, why they believed they could manipulate the system so easily. Did you know, I asked, searching his face for any sign of complicity. I swear to you I had no idea about the forged documents or the unauthorized accounts. When Robert first approached me about estate planning, everything seemed legitimate. But after reviewing these records, he gestured helplessly at the mountain of evidence surrounding us. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Hope you're not letting lawyers fill your head with nonsense. Families should stick together." The casual tone of her message, the assumption that she could still manipulate me even now, sparked something fierce in my chest. "I want to contact the police," I said firmly. Morrison nodded slowly. "I think that's necessary. This level of identity theft and financial fraud requires criminal investigation." As he reached for his phone to contact authorities, I thought about all the years I had felt grateful to my parents for their financial guidance, all the times I had praised them to friends for being so helpful, so supportive. The sick irony was that their support had been purchased with my own money stolen and laundered through elaborate schemes I was only beginning to understand. The rental income alone represented almost 2 years of my car payments. The offshore transfers suggested a level of sophistication that terrified me. This wasn't impulsive theft. This was systematic long-term financial abuse orchestrated by people who were supposed to love and protect me. When Detective Sarah Walsh arrived 30 minutes later, her no-nonsense demeanor provided the first comfort I had felt in days. She listened intently as Morrison and I explained the situation, taking detailed notes and asking pointed questions that revealed her expertise in financial crimes. "How long have your parents had access to your personal information?" she asked. "My whole life." I answered, then realized how naive that sounded. "I mean, they've always handled family financial matters. I trusted them." Detective Walsh nodded with the weary understanding of someone who had seen this pattern before. "Family financial abuse is more common than people realize. The trust factor makes victims particularly vulnerable." As she began collecting evidence, boxing up documents, and preparing to seize records, I felt something shifting inside me. The grief and betrayal were still there, but underneath those emotions, something harder was taking root. Something that felt like determination mixed with righteous anger. My parents had spent years building their financial house of cards, using my identity as the foundation. Now it was time to watch that house burn down around them. Detective Walsh's investigation moved with terrifying efficiency. Within a week, she had uncovered a web of financial crimes that stretched far beyond my family's betrayal. Her phone call requesting another meeting carried an urgency that made my heart race. "Natalie, we need to talk immediately. What we've discovered goes much deeper than your case alone." The police station conference room smelled like stale coffee and disappointment. Walsh spread photographs across the table, each one showing elderly individuals whose faces carried the same hollow expression of betrayal I had been wearing for days. "Your parents are part of a larger operation," Walsh explained, her voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who had seen too much human cruelty. "We've identified at least 7 other families who've been victimized using identical methods." The photographs told stories of systematic exploitation. Margaret Chen, 83, whose children convinced her to modify her will, then manipulated her grandson into signing over his inheritance. Frank Rodriguez, 79, whose nephew used forged documents to drain his retirement accounts. Sarah Kim, 86, whose daughter and son-in-law established fraudulent trusts to steal her property. "The pattern is always the same," Walsh continued. "Target elderly relatives with substantial assets, manipulate them into changing estate documents, then exploit the beneficiaries by claiming family authority over inherited wealth." Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Detective, I need to disclose something. Robert Patterson approached me about estate planning for 3 other families over the past 2 years. Families I now recognize from your investigation. The confession hung in the air like toxic smoke. My parents hadn't just betrayed me, they had turned their attorney into an unwitting accomplice in a multi-family crime spree. "Mr. Morrison," Walsh said carefully, "we need complete records of every transaction you handled for the Pattersons, every document, every communication, every financial transfer." Morrison's face had gone ashen. "I've been an attorney for 22 years. I never imagined I was facilitating criminal activity. But I was beginning to understand that my parents' manipulation extended far beyond simple financial theft. They had studied their victims, identified vulnerabilities, and exploited trust with surgical precision. How many families, I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Based on current evidence, at least 12 families have been affected over the past 5 years, Walsh replied. Total damages appear to exceed $2 million. The scope of their operation was staggering. My parents weren't desperate people who had made poor choices. They were career criminals who had built their lifestyle on systematic theft from vulnerable relatives. Walsh produced another folder, this one containing surveillance photographs. "We've been watching your parents since our investigation began. These images were taken yesterday." The photos showed my parents at an upscale travel agency, examining brochures for international destinations. Non-extradition countries based on the agency's specialty services advertised in the window. "They're planning to flee," I said, the realization hitting me like cold water. "We believe so. We've also discovered additional offshore accounts and evidence of false identification documents." Morrison cleared his throat nervously. "Detective, there's something else. Robert has been making payments to me beyond our normal fee structure. Payments I now realize were intended to ensure my cooperation and silence." The admission transformed Morrison from unwitting accomplice to potential co-conspirator, but his willingness to disclose the information suggested genuine remorse rather than calculated damage control. "How much?" Walsh asked. $15,000 over 6 months, Morrison replied quietly. He claimed it was for discretionary services and estate planning complexity. I should have questioned it more thoroughly. The hush money explained why Morrison had seemed so cooperative with my parents' increasingly elaborate trust schemes. They had purchased his compliance along with his legal services. Walsh's radio crackled with activity. After a brief conversation, she turned back to us with grim satisfaction. "We're moving to arrest Robert and Linda Patterson this afternoon. The federal prosecutor has approved charges for racketeering, identity theft, and organized financial fraud." The moment I had been both dreading and anticipating was finally arriving. Part of me still couldn't believe that the people who had raised me, who had attended my school plays, and helped me move into college dormitories, were about to be arrested as career criminals. But another part of me, the part that had been systematically gaslighted and manipulated for years, felt a fierce satisfaction at the prospect of justice. "What happens to the other families?" I asked. "Asset recovery proceedings will begin immediately," Walsh explained. "Federal authorities are freezing all accounts associated with your parents' operation. Depending on what we recover, victims may see partial or complete restitution." Morrison gathered his papers with shaking hands. "Detective Walsh, I want to cooperate fully with your investigation. I realize my career is likely over, but I need to help make this right." As we left the police station, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the sensation of standing on solid ground. For too long, my reality had been shaped by people who had their own hidden agendas. Now finally, I was beginning to see the truth clearly. That afternoon, I watched from my apartment window as police cars surrounded my childhood home. When they led my parents away in handcuffs, my mother turned back toward the house with an expression of pure rage. Not remorse, not shame, but fury at being caught. In that moment, I understood that I had never really known these people at all. The parents I had loved and trusted were fictional characters, carefully constructed personas designed to hide the calculating criminals underneath. But I also realized that their arrest was just the beginning. The real work of rebuilding my life, recovering stolen assets, and helping other victims find justice was still ahead of me. The phone call from my bank came at 6:30 in the morning, jolting me from the first decent sleep I had managed in weeks. The customer service representative's voice carried an apologetic professionalism that immediately set my nerves on edge. "Ms. Patterson, we need to inform you that all accounts associated with your Social Security number have been frozen pending federal investigation. This includes your checking, savings, and credit card accounts." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. "How long will this take?" "Unfortunately, we don't have a timeline. Federal financial crime investigations can take months or even years to resolve." Hanging up the phone, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw a stranger looking back. Dark circles ringed my eyes, and my usually neat appearance had devolved into whatever clothes happened to be clean. The woman I had been just 2 weeks ago felt like someone from a different lifetime. My laptop showed 17 missed emails from creditors, each one more threatening than the last. Credit cards I had never applied for were demanding payment on balances I had never incurred. Student loans I thought I had paid off years ago were suddenly active again, accruing interest and penalties. The doorbell rang and I opened it to find my landlord holding an official-looking document. "Natalie, I'm sorry about this, but I received notice that your credit has been compromised. I need to discuss your lease situation." Apparently, my parents' identity theft had been so thorough that even my rental history was now questionable. The background check that had qualified me for my apartment was based on fraudulent information they had created and maintained over years. By 10 o'clock, I was sitting in attorney Patricia Barnes' office, surrounded by boxes of evidence that represented the destruction of my financial life. Barnes had been recommended by Detective Walsh as someone who specialized in identity theft recovery, and her reputation for aggressive advocacy was exactly what I needed. "Natalie, I'm going to be direct with you," Barnes said, her steel gray hair and no-nonsense demeanor inspiring immediate confidence. "What your parents did to you represents one of the most sophisticated identity theft cases I've encountered. Rebuilding your financial identity is going to be a long, difficult process." She spread out documents that showed the full scope of the damage. Credit cards in my name with balances totaling $63,000. Personal loans I had never applied for. A second mortgage on the lake house that I knew nothing about. "The good news is that we have clear evidence of fraud," Barnes continued. "The bad news is that proving fraud and recovering from fraud are two very different processes. My employer had been understanding initially, but as the investigation expanded and my financial situation became more complicated, their patience was wearing thin. Marketing executives needed security clearances for certain clients, and employees with ongoing federal investigations were considered potential liabilities. "They put me on administrative leave," I admitted to Barnes. "Paid for now, but if this drags on..." Barnes nodded grimly. "Financial crime victims often become secondary victims of the system designed to help them. We'll need to be strategic about managing your professional reputation while we work on recovery." The rental management company for the lake house had called that morning, demanding clarification about ownership and threatening eviction proceedings. They had been dealing with my parents for over a year, accepting them as legitimate representatives of the property. Now, with the federal investigation ongoing, they weren't sure who had authority to make decisions about the rental agreements. "Can I stay at the lake house while this gets sorted out?" I asked. "Technically, yes. You're the legal owner according to the deed," Barnes replied. "But I'd recommend avoiding it until we clarify all the financial entanglements. If there are liens or claims against the property, your presence there could complicate things." So I found myself back in my childhood bedroom in my apartment, surrounded by boxes of evidence and legal documents. The irony wasn't lost on me that my parents' crimes had essentially made me homeless while they sat in federal detention. Barnes scheduled a meeting with federal prosecutors for the following week. "They'll want to interview you about your parents' activities both as a victim and as a potential witness. Your cooperation could significantly impact their sentencing." The thought of testifying against my parents should have felt traumatic, but instead I felt a strange sense of relief. Finally, someone with authority was taking the situation seriously. Finally, there would be consequences for years of systematic abuse. That evening, Morrison called with news that was both encouraging and terrifying. "Natalie, I've been working with federal investigators to trace assets. We've located several offshore accounts containing substantial funds." How much, I asked, afraid to hope. "Preliminary estimates suggest over $400,000 across multiple accounts and institutions," Morrison replied. "If we can prove these funds came from criminal activity, they'll be available for victim restitution." The amount was staggering, far more than I had ever imagined my parents could steal. But it also meant their criminal operation had been even more extensive than investigators had initially believed. Barnes called an emergency meeting for the next morning. When I arrived at her office, she was already on the phone with federal prosecutors, her voice carrying an excitement I hadn't heard before. "Natalie, sit down. What Morrison discovered changes everything." She ended her call and turned to face me with something approaching a smile. "Your parents kept detailed records of their activities, financial spreadsheets, victim profiles, even correspondence discussing their methods. They documented their crimes extensively. Apparently, they were planning to write a book about financial manipulation after they retired to their non-extradition country." Barnes shook her head in disbelief. "Their arrogance may have been our greatest asset." The evidence included victim selection criteria, success rate analyses, and profit projections that read like a business plan for systematic elder abuse. My parents hadn't just been stealing money, they had been perfecting their techniques and scaling their operation. "The prosecutor believes this evidence will support racketeering charges," Barnes continued. "That means much longer sentences and much better asset recovery prospects for victims." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something approaching optimism. My parents' meticulous record-keeping intended to help them refine their criminal enterprise was going to be the key to their downfall. But as I left Barnes' office that afternoon, I realized that legal victory was only part of the healing process. The deeper work of understanding how I had been so thoroughly deceived and learning to trust my own judgment again was still ahead of me. The safety deposit box discovery came from an unexpected source. Morrison's secretary, while organizing his files for the federal investigation, found a key taped inside a folder marked Patterson Family Estate Planning. The key bore no identifying information, just a number 847. Detective Walsh traced the number to First National Bank, where records showed the box had been rented under my name 18 months earlier. Another forgery, another violation, another layer of betrayal to process. "We need you present when we open it," Walsh explained as we stood outside the bank's vault. "Since it's technically in your name, we need your consent for the search." The bank manager, visibly nervous about the federal investigation surrounding one of their safety deposit boxes, led us through multiple security doors into a sterile room lined with metal boxes. Box 847 sat innocuously among hundreds of others, giving no hint of the secrets it contained. When the lid opened, I felt my reality shift once again. Inside were documents that revealed the true scope of my parents' criminal ambitions. False passports bearing their photographs but different names. Bank routing numbers for accounts in countries I couldn't pronounce. Most chilling of all, detailed escape plans that had been refined and updated over months. Project Fresh Start. Walsh read from a spiral notebook filled with my father's meticulous handwriting. Phase 1, complete asset liquidation. Phase 2, final victim exploitation. Phase 3, departure and disappearance. The notebook contained schedules, contact information for document forgers, and research on countries without extradition treaties with the United States. My parents hadn't just been planning to flee, they had been methodically preparing for years. But it was the victim profiles that made my blood run cold. Detailed psychological assessments of their targets, including me. My profile read like a psychological case study, analyzing my trusting nature, my desire to please authority figures, and my financial naivety. They had studied me like a lab rat, identifying exactly which emotional buttons to push for maximum compliance. Subject shows excellent potential for long-term exploitation. I read aloud from my own file. Strong family loyalty makes her unlikely to question authority figures. Limited financial sophistication ensures continued dependence on guidance. Walsh placed a gentle hand on my shoulder as I struggled to process the clinical detachment with which my parents had analyzed their own daughter. Natalie, this isn't a reflection of any failure on your part. These are the observations of experienced con artists who spent years perfecting their techniques. The evidence included correspondence with other family members I hadn't seen in years. Apparently, my parents had been manipulating relatives across the country, using information about family gatherings and events to identify potential new victims. They had maintained detailed financial records showing profits from each victim's success rates for different manipulation techniques and projections for future earnings. The spreadsheets read like quarterly business reports complete with charts and graphs analyzing their criminal enterprise's growth. But perhaps most disturbing were the love letters between my parents discussing their crimes with the casual intimacy of couples planning vacation destinations. They referred to their victims by code names, celebrated successful thefts like anniversary milestones, and expressed genuine affection for each other based on their shared criminal activities. My darling partner in crime, my mother had written, the golden goose exceeded expectations this quarter. Her trusting nature continues to be our greatest asset. I love building our future with you one successful project at a time. The golden goose. That was me, the daughter they had raised, nurtured, and systematically exploited for over a decade. Barnes arrived as we were documenting the evidence, her expression growing more grim with each revelation. Natalie, this changes the entire legal landscape. This level of premeditation and organization supports federal racketeering charges. The evidence also revealed connections to other criminals, contact information for document forgers, money laundering specialists, and offshore banking facilitators. My parents hadn't been working alone. They were part of a larger network of financial predators. How many people? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Based on these records, at least 23 families across 7 states, Walsh replied. Total damages could exceed $2 million. Morrison, who had been growing increasingly pale as the evidence mounted, finally spoke up. I need to make a full confession. Robert Patterson has been paying me substantial amounts beyond normal legal fees. I believed it was for complex estate work, but I realize now it was hush money. How much? Barnes asked sharply. Approximately $47,000 over 2 years, Morrison admitted. He claimed it was for discretionary services and confidential family matters. I should have questioned it, should have reported it. The hush money explained Morrison's willingness to process questionable documents without adequate verification. My parents had systematically compromised their attorney's professional judgment through financial incentives. But Barnes' expression suggested she saw opportunity in Morrison's corruption. Mr. Morrison, your cooperation could be crucial for conviction. Are you willing to testify about their methods and payments? Morrison nodded miserably. I want to make this right. My career is over, but maybe I can help ensure justice for the victims. The safety deposit box also contained evidence of attempted witness intimidation. Letters my parents had drafted but never sent threatening relatives who might testify against them. Character assassination plans targeting family members who had begun asking uncomfortable questions about financial transactions. As we cataloged the evidence, I realized that my parents' criminal sophistication went far beyond simple theft. They had built a comprehensive system for identifying, exploiting, and silencing victims. The fact that they had documented everything so meticulously suggested a level of arrogance that bordered on sociopathy. Walsh's radio crackled with an update from federal prosecutors. After a brief conversation, she turned to us with satisfaction. The grand jury has approved expanded charges based on this evidence. Robert and Linda Patterson will now face federal racketeering charges, which carry much longer sentences and more comprehensive asset forfeiture. Walking out of the bank that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this nightmare began: a sense of actual progress. The evidence in that safety deposit box had transformed me from isolated victim to key witness in a major federal investigation. My parents' meticulous record-keeping intended to help them perfect their criminal enterprise was going to be the foundation for their destruction. Their arrogance had become their weakness, and their documentation would ensure justice for every family they had victimized. The federal courthouse in downtown Cincinnati buzzed with activity as victim families gathered for the trial that had consumed our lives for 8 months. I recognized faces from Detective Walsh's photographs, but seeing these families in person added a human dimension that no investigative file could capture. Margaret Chen walked with a cane, now her 83-year-old frame bent with the weight of betrayal by her own children. Frank Rodriguez sat in a wheelchair, the stress of financial devastation having triggered health problems that left him unable to walk. These weren't just crime statistics. They were real people whose lives had been shattered by systematic exploitation. Federal prosecutor Amanda Richardson had spent weeks preparing us for trial testimony. Your parents' defense team will try to portray them as confused elderly people who made poor financial decisions, she had warned. They'll claim diminished capacity, family stress, anything to avoid accountability for organized criminal activity. But the evidence spoke for itself. The prosecution's opening statement detailed a criminal enterprise that spanned 5 years and victimized 26 families across multiple states. The systematic nature of the crimes, the detailed planning, and the sophisticated money laundering techniques painted a picture of career criminals, not confused elderly people. Defense attorney Marcus Webb stood before the jury with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to defending white-collar criminals. Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear about a family torn apart by misunderstandings, poor communication, and the complexities of modern estate planning. Robert and Linda Patterson are not criminal masterminds. They're confused seniors who made mistakes while trying to help their family. The defense strategy became clear immediately. They would claim temporary insanity, family pressure, and manipulation by unscrupulous financial advisors. They would portray my parents as victims of their own good intentions, people who had gotten in over their heads while trying to protect family assets. But when Richardson began presenting evidence, the defense narrative crumbled under the weight of documentation. The safety deposit box contents told the story of criminals who had planned every detail of their operation with meticulous precision. Phase 3, Departure and Disappearance. Richardson read from my father's notebook. Final asset liquidation must be completed by March 15th. New identities activated upon arrival in non-extradition destination. The jury's expressions shifted as they processed the clinical detachment of the planning documents. These weren't the confused ramblings of elderly people making poor decisions. They were the systematic preparations of career criminals. When Morrison took the stand, his testimony provided crucial context about the systematic corruption that had enabled the criminal enterprise. Robert Patterson approached me specifically because of our college friendship. He knew I would trust him, would process documents without adequate verification. "How much money did Mr. Patterson pay you beyond normal legal fees?" Richardson asked. $47,000 over 2 years. Morrison replied quietly. He claimed it was for complex family matters requiring discretion. I realize now it was payment for my willingness to look the other way. The defense tried to paint Morrison as the real criminal, claiming he had manipulated my parents into illegal activities for his own financial gain. But the evidence told a different story. Morrison had been a tool carefully selected and systematically compromised to provide legal cover for criminal activities. Margaret Chen's testimony brought tears to several jurors' eyes. They convinced my daughter that I was becoming senile, that I couldn't manage my own finances anymore. Then they used that fear to manipulate both of us into transferring my retirement savings. Frank Rodriguez spoke about watching his nephew destroy family relationships while stealing his life savings. I trusted him because he was family. I never imagined someone would spend years planning to rob their own relatives. But it was my own testimony that seemed to affect the jury most profoundly. Richardson had prepared me for the defense's attempts to portray me as a disgruntled daughter, seeking revenge against loving parents. "Can you describe your relationship with your parents before discovering their criminal activities?" Richardson asked. "I thought we had a wonderful relationship," I replied honestly. "I trusted them completely. I was grateful for their financial guidance and support. I never suspected that their help was actually systematic theft using my own money." The defense cross-examination was brutal. Webb tried to portray me as financially irresponsible, suggesting that my parents had been forced to intervene to prevent me from making poor decisions. "Isn't it true, Ms. Patterson, that you were struggling with debt when your grandmother died?" "No, that's not true. I had student loans like most people my age, but my finances were stable." "And isn't it true that you asked your parents to help manage your inheritance because you felt overwhelmed by financial responsibility?" "They convinced me that inheritance money required special handling for tax purposes. I trusted their expertise." Webb produced documents that I had never seen before, financial records that purported to show erratic spending patterns and poor financial decisions on my part. But Richardson's objections were sustained when it became clear that these documents had been fabricated using the same techniques my parents had employed throughout their criminal enterprise. The prosecution's closing argument tied together months of evidence into a comprehensive picture of systematic criminal activity. Robert and Linda Patterson didn't make mistakes. They made choices. They chose to steal from vulnerable family members. They chose to forge documents and manipulate legal systems. They chose to plan escape routes and hide assets offshore. The defense wants you to believe that detailed criminal planning, sophisticated money laundering, and systematic victim manipulation were the products of confusion and good intentions. But the evidence shows career criminals who spent years perfecting techniques for exploiting family trust. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts, including federal racketeering charges, I felt a satisfaction so profound it was almost spiritual. Judge Harrison sentenced Robert to 12 years in federal prison and Linda to 10 years. But more importantly, he ordered complete asset forfeiture and restitution to all victims. The defendants exploited the most fundamental bonds of family trust to perpetrate sophisticated criminal enterprises. Judge Harrison said during sentencing, "Their actions represent a betrayal not just of individual victims, but of the social bonds that hold families and communities together." Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon, I was surrounded by other victim families who had become like extended family over the months of legal proceedings. We had supported each other through testimony, shared evidence and resources, and built genuine relationships founded on mutual understanding of trauma and recovery. Margaret Chen hugged me with surprising strength. "Your courage to fight this gave all of us hope," she said. "Thank you for not letting them get away with it." Frank Rodriguez shook my hand with tears in his eyes. "Justice feels good, doesn't it? My nephew thought he was so smart. But family criminals always underestimate their victims' determination." The asset recovery process would take months, but federal investigators had located most of the stolen funds. Preliminary estimates suggested that victims would recover 60 to 70% of their losses, with additional funds becoming available as ongoing investigations uncovered more hidden assets. Standing on the courthouse steps in the afternoon sunshine, I realized that this legal victory was just the beginning of a larger healing process. The real work of rebuilding trust relationships and financial security was still ahead of all of us. But for the first time in almost a year, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. The people who had systematically betrayed and exploited me were finally facing consequences for their actions. Justice hadn't healed all the wounds they had inflicted, but it had provided a foundation for beginning the work of recovery. 6 months after the trial, I stood on the deck of the lake house, watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold and amber. The property that had been the center of so much conflict and pain was finally truly mine. More importantly, it was becoming something my grandmother Rose would have been proud of. The sign by the front door read, "Rose's Haven, a retreat center for financial crime survivors." What had begun as my personal recovery process had evolved into something much larger, a place where families destroyed by financial predators could find support resources and healing. Patricia Barnes had agreed to serve as the center's legal counsel, providing pro bono services to help victims navigate the complex process of financial recovery. Her experience with my case had opened her eyes to the widespread nature of family financial abuse, and she was determined to use her expertise to help other survivors. Natalie, the morning group, is ready to begin, called Daniel Morrison from the kitchen. He was James Morrison's younger brother, a certified financial planner who had volunteered to help educate victims about rebuilding credit and managing recovered assets. Unlike his brother, Daniel had built his career on genuine service rather than compromised ethics. The retreat center had welcomed 43 families in its first 6 months of operation, providing week-long intensive programs that combined legal education, financial counseling, and trauma therapy. The funding came from my own asset recovery settlement donations from previous participants and grants from organizations focused on elder abuse prevention. Detective Walsh had become a regular visitor, using her expertise to help educate families about recognizing and preventing financial exploitation. Her presentations on warning signs had become so popular that other law enforcement agencies requested copies of her materials. The most important thing to remember, Walsh had told our latest group of participants, is that financial predators rely on shame and isolation to control their victims. Building community and sharing experiences breaks that control. The morning support group met in what had been the lake house's main living room, now furnished with comfortable chairs, arranged in a circle. 8 survivors sat sharing their experiences, their voices carrying the mixture of pain and determination I recognized from my own journey. Margaret Chen had become a regular facilitator, her experience and wisdom providing comfort to newly discovered victims. "The hardest part isn't the money," she told the group. "It's learning to trust your own judgment again after being systematically gaslighted by people you loved." Frank Rodriguez had regained much of his mobility through physical therapy, and his weekly presentations on elder abuse prevention had become legendary among law enforcement and social service agencies. His combination of personal experience and passionate advocacy made him an incredibly effective educator. The center's first major success story was the Garcia family, whose adult children had been systematically stealing from elderly parents while claiming to provide care. The evidence gathering and legal strategy we had developed during my case provided a template that led to criminal convictions and nearly complete asset recovery. James Morrison had served his community service sentence by providing pro bono legal work for financial crime victims. His cooperation with federal authorities had led to the prosecution of the document forgery network my parents had used, resulting in additional criminal convictions and victim restitution. But perhaps the most meaningful development was my relationship with Daniel. What had begun as a professional collaboration based on shared experience had grown into something deeper. He understood the unique trauma of family betrayal in ways that people with normal family experiences simply couldn't. "Your grandmother would be amazed," Daniel said as we prepared for the day's activities. "She left you an inheritance that you've transformed into something that will help hundreds of families." The lake house had been renovated to accommodate retreats while maintaining its peaceful, home-like atmosphere. The master bedroom had become a library and resource center. The guest bedrooms housed visiting families. The deck had been expanded to provide space for group activities and individual reflection. Federal investigators continued uncovering assets hidden by my parents and their criminal network. Each new discovery meant additional restitution for victims funding that we channeled back into expansion of support services. The latest recovery had provided enough funding to hire a full-time trauma counselor and a victim advocate. The center's success had attracted attention from national advocacy organizations focused on elder abuse prevention. We'd received requests to develop training materials for law enforcement social workers and legal professionals. The systematic documentation of effective intervention strategies was becoming a resource for professionals across the country. My parents remained in federal prison serving their sentences with no possibility of early release. I hadn't spoken to them since the trial, and I had no intention of doing so. Some relationships once broken by systematic betrayal couldn't be repaired. Learning to accept that reality had been an important part of my healing process. But I had built new family relationships with the community of survivors who'd become central to my life. Margaret Chen had become like a grandmother, her wisdom and strength inspiring everyone who met her. Frank Rodriguez felt like a beloved uncle, his humor and determination lifting spirits during difficult moments. The center had also attracted volunteers who brought their own expertise and passion to the work. A retired FBI agent helped with security assessments for families still being threatened by their financial predators. A former bank examiner taught workshops on recognizing fraudulent documents. A social worker specialized in helping families rebuild trust and communication after financial abuse. As the sun climbed higher over the lake, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The financial theft had been devastating, but it had also revealed inner strength I hadn't known I possessed. The family betrayal had been crushing, but it had opened space for genuine relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation. The morning support group was sharing their goals for recovery. Some wanted to rebuild their financial security. Others focused on healing relationships with family members who'd been deceived but not involved in criminal activity. A few were planning their own advocacy work, determined to use their experiences to help other victims. "What about you, Natalie?" Margaret asked. "What are your goals as we move forward?" I looked around the room at faces that had become dear to me, people who had found strength in shared experience and mutual support. I want to continue building this community. I want to help other families discover that financial predators lose their power when victims refuse to remain isolated and ashamed. "And personally?" Daniel asked with a gentle smile that reminded me daily why I had learned to trust again. "Personally, I want to remember that healing isn't about forgetting the past or pretending it didn't happen. It's about transforming pain into purpose and isolation into community." As our group prepared for the day's workshops, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from meaningful work. The lake house that my parents had tried to steal as the foundation for their escape plans had become something far more valuable, a place where broken families could begin to heal. The afternoon brought new families seeking support, their stories, unfortunately familiar, but their presence expanding our community of survivors. Each new arrival reminded me that the work we were doing mattered, that systematic financial abuse thrived in darkness and secrecy, but couldn't survive transparency and mutual support. That evening, as Daniel and I sat on the deck watching the sunset reflect off the calm water, I thought about the life lesson this experience had taught me. Sometimes the people who hurt us most give us the greatest opportunity to help others heal. True family isn't about blood relations, but about people who genuinely support your growth and well-being. The lake house that had been intended as the foundation for my parents' criminal escape had instead become a foundation for healing and justice. Grandma Rose's inheritance, stolen and hidden by people who should have protected it, had been recovered and transformed into something that would help families for generations to come. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, I felt the peace that comes from purpose fulfilled and community built on genuine care rather than manipulation. The financial crimes that had devastated my life had also revealed the possibility of transformation, healing, and service to others facing similar trauma. The work would continue, families would heal, and financial predators would face the consequences of their actions. But tonight, I was simply grateful for the journey that had brought me home, to myself, and to a community of people who understood that survival wasn't enough. True healing required transformation of pain into purpose. Have you ever experienced a situation where someone you trusted completely betrayed that trust? How did you find the strength to rebuild and move forward? Your experiences and insights could help other families facing similar challenges. Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage and recovery, and share this with anyone who might benefit from hearing about the power of community in healing from betrayal. Thank you for being part of this journey toward justice and healing, and remember that no matter how dark the betrayal, there is always hope for rebuilding a life filled with genuine love and trust.